everybody, and welcome to episode 438 of Retro Encounter. I am not Mike Sollosi. I am your guest host for this wonderful Vanillaware episode of Retro Encounter. I am Wes Iliff, and we'll be going a little bit into the history of Vanillaware and spill love all over the games that have been released, at least those that were released in the West. But I am not alone in this venture. Also joining us are Gio Castillo.
Hello.
Ben Love.
Hey.
And Nick Mangiaracina.
Greetings.
Y'all, Vanillaware is kind of a broad topic to talk about, and obviously we're not going to be able to go super deep on the individual games they're in, although we'll go as deep as we can while not being here all day. But I want to talk to y'all about kind of how you learned about Vanillaware and how you got into Vanillaware. So for me, for instance, it was Odinsphere. When Odinsphere came out, it got such word of mouth behind it that it was hard not to pay attention if you were active in the RPG sphere during that era. But even more so, it was an Atlas game. And during the PS2 era, if you wanted an Atlas game, you better buy it in the first 2 weeks, or else it's going to be impossible to find soon after. Luckily, that has changed in recent years. But from there, that beautiful animation, I think, sold me as much as anything, and I was kind of a lifer for Vanillaware from there. But how about the rest of you? Let's start with Gio.
Well, for me, actually, I started out being a bit more critical of Vanillaware because I wasn't. I mean, I played and finished through the first two Vanillaware games I played, which were Muramasa and Odinsphere, and I was like, oh, this is okay, but it's like I had my issues with both of them, but then it all kind of turned around when I played 13 Sentinels. Yeah, I just fell in love completely, and I was like, oh, so this is what they're good at, and I've since kind of like even revisited those older games that I played, and I found something to like about them. And yeah, ever since then, I've been a fan of pretty much all their games.
I get the feeling we're going to have a lot to talk about with 13 Sentinels. Definitely kind of a game changer for them in a lot of ways. How about you, Nick?
So I was thinking about it, and I know we talked before the podcast, and I had said that I had only played the Vita version of Muramasa. But actually, I think I did play the Wii version. Was that the original, or was the
that
original
was the original?
PS2?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So I did play the Wii version. That was my first Vanillaware game, and I loved it. I had mostly been playing turn-based games and like online strategy games before that, and so it was very new to me, and I really enjoyed playing that game.
Yeah, I think Muramasa is kind of like the black sheep in some ways. Like it doesn't get the acclaim that a lot of the rest of the games do, but I think it's still, Vanillaware at their best when you really get down to it. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, my first Vanillaware game was Grim Grimoire on the
Oh, wow.
PS2. And then, I played a little bit of the original release of Odinsphere. But I would say that I became like a really big fan with the release of Muramasa Rebirth on the Vita. And then, that's what really got me into the studio and the Dragon's Crown and the Odinsphere remake and all the games that come after. I think really the remakes of their titles are what really got me to kind of fall in love with the studio. And I think they're one of those rare developers who returns to their old work multiple times and then every time makes it something better, which is really, I think, unique in the industry.
They really are kind of on top of their game when it comes to updating their old games, but not changing the core of them. I feel like half the reason they wanted to update Odinsphere was because the PS2 was limiting their visual fidelity, and they just wanted to make it pretty like they saw it, which is an interesting note in the development of that game. And Muramasa has a little bit of a history with RPG Fan, as we did a couple of episodes on it back in 2021. So if you're interested in hearing deeper thoughts about at the bare minimum Muramasa, you can go back in retro history and see a full panel that played through it and talked a lot more deeply than we're about to over it. Um, but I wanted to start first and foremost with a little bit of a history lesson. So essentially, I'm going to walk us through the history of Vanillaware a little bit, and we'll stop off at each game to have a nice group chat about it. I'll keep the history relatively brief, but there are a few interesting details that I think y'all will like. Um, but it is impossible to start discussing Vanillaware without discussing Princess Crown. Um, because not only what did it have a huge impact on the company's one of the company's founders, George Kamitani, um, it impacted the next like six, like almost 6 games. Like the next several games they made were all very, very deeply tied to this concept. Um, so George Kamitani, company founder and director of most of Vanillaware's games, had started working for various companies in like low-level jobs, art jobs, programming jobs, primarily art, notably including Capcom, working on the D&D Tower of Doom game, if anyone remembers those old D&D RPG beat-em-ups for the arcade. Um, but once he went and decided to kind of make a name for himself and actually direct, his first game was Princess Crown for the Saturn. This was originally a concept of something in the vein of Princess Maker and Princess Maker 2, which are more like life sim, raise this princess, make her capable of taking on the challenges that will come later in her life. But in trying to sell this new game that he was making specifically to Sega, he decided to shift production from this life simulator to an action RPG as something that was a little bit more marketable, and it became a side scroller and a budget title, both due to how much money he was able to get for it. Um, but it's a game that is a little bit renowned, but has never been released properly in English. I don't think that one even has a fan translation, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, there's a
Um,
translation, like a web based, like a browser based translation of the entire script that you can like read along as you play. But there's all the groups that have attempted to do a fan translation of Princess Crown have run into issues because of the, its history as a Saturn game, and just it's a difficult like architecture, and the technical stuff with it is very difficult. So no team has been able to actually implement a translation into the game files.
even all these years later, Saturn remains a tough nut to crack. There's never been really truly perfect emulation for it, and I know that difficulty translates over to like trying to make translation patches and things like that.
Yeah, there
Um,
there was one port, which is the PSP version,
mhm.
and that runs like pretty well. Like if you were curious and trying it out, that's the version I would recommend because it's the most easily accessible. But yeah, it's a tough one to experience if you don't speak Japanese.
Yes. And it was kind of unique in its own way. It's become a cult classic in later years. But at the time, it was released really late in the Saturn life cycle, which did it no favors. It was released as a budget title and ultimately ended up being a commercial failure that would kind of haunt Kamitani for years. Um, it's interesting though, you'll see so many like side-scrolling action RPGs. There are a good number of them, and a lot of them were heavily influenced because this was kind of like a game director's game more so than a game for the fans. People saw really cool ideas and wanted to iterate on those. Um, Kamitani went through a few more career changes before founding Vanillaware, but we're not going to go super deep on those because it's not a Kamitani encounter; it's a Vanillaware encounter. Um, so he decided to try his best to create a proper successor to Princess Crown. Eventually, after shopping the concept around and having difficulties because his noted failure on Princess Crown followed him around like a black mark in the industry. But finally, Atlas was willing to work with him on it. So he began working on a game called Odin Sphere. Unfortunately, Odin Sphere was planned to release close to a little Atlas RPG known as Persona 3. Um, I don't know if you guys have heard of that one.
No,
Little
no.
kind of near indie title. So they delayed Odin Sphere a ways out, which left kind of dire financial straits. for Vanillaware, which will become a recurring a recurring theme throughout here. So they kind of rushed out another title to try to keep themselves afloat. Um, which even taking out a significant loan to keep the company afloat during this transitionary period. And they ended up releasing a game a month before the scheduled release of Odin Sphere called Grim Grimoire. Um, this was something of a love letter to tactical RPGs. Starcraft is thrown around in so many interviews by so many staff members as the primary inspiration for Grim Grimoire. It's this interesting little 2D um, mix of RPG, maybe a little element of tower defense, working on multiple levels of a tower, um, and kind of deploying forces to work in their own lane or across other lanes, um, making this interesting mix on a console version of a strategy RPG. It was well received, but commercially did not do what Vanillaware needed it to do. They had planned this game with a sequel in mind, but that sequel never managed to coalesce due to the low sales of the original. And since then, Vanillaware has explicitly aimed to produce games that are complete in and of themselves with no sequels planned. And they've worked that so far. Vanillaware has not produced a sequel in their life. Um, but let's dig in a little bit on Grim Grimoire. Have you all played Grim Grimoire? Do you have any feelings on either it or the later remake that it got, Grim Grimoire Once More, for modern consoles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting game. It's probably the most different game compared to most of their output, with it bearing the most resemblance to their most recent game, Unicorn Overlord. But even then, it's still very different than that. You know, the setting and the story, it's kind of like a magical girl, like magical school setting, which is really unique compared to most of their games, and really like a lot of RPGs in general. And I think that gives it kind of a unique feel and vibe. And the gameplay is pretty good. It's fun. It's a very simple, it's a more simple RTS than what you would find on like a PC, for example. There's not as much micromanagement, which is good because you're playing with a controller. But it's a neat little game, and I do think the remake is very good. It adds some quality of life things, like you can save in the middle of battle. You can fast forward your unit's actions to make things go a little faster, so there's not as much waiting around. And they added like skill trees to the familiars you summon and stuff, so there's just like a lot of little updates that make the game a little more modern. So I think if you like strategy games, it's definitely worth going back to.
Yeah, actually, and I would add about the fast forward thing, that is a game changer, because like I was actually able to finish Grim Grimoire in like 3 hours. Yeah, the game, it turns out, is actually really fast if you can like do 8 times speed for the campaign. So
Not only is it like a breezily paced game, especially when you can fast forward, um, that kind of echoes a lot of its design. It's a game that in a casual playthrough you probably broke. Like you were
Mhm.
probably able to massively break the familiar system and dominate stages in the late game.
Yeah,
Um,
which is something it shares with Unicorn Overlord too.
absolutely. That power fantasy is something I enjoy about Vanillaware games at times. Um, but it really is fairy tale. This really put, from the very beginning, that Vanillaware is a big fan of dreamlike fairy tale kind of settings. You're in this magic school. You've got the full witch pointed hat on your main character. You're talking to mice with human voices. You're talking to different disciplines of magic. All of the creatures that you're summoning are these beautifully rendered mythological creatures, reimagined by Vanillaware. It really set the tone for what they would do, in that they would try to do, give some focus to storytelling as much as they could, but the atmosphere was what really sold the story, not necessarily the storytelling. um, and this one is a magical school fairy tale combination that really speaks to the aesthetic vision of George Kamatani throughout maybe the entirety of his directing career with Vanillaware.
Yeah, it's also probably the most restrained in terms of some of the I don't know, more risque elements to Vanillaware's art, which I think maybe makes it a little more approachable to most people. So if that stuff bothers you or turns you off, then Grim Grimoire is a good place to still get an experience of what Vanillaware's art design and everything is like. But there won't be any, scantily clad women in your face for the most part.
Yeah. Kamitani does love unrealistic proportions, and this will definitely come into play more and more as we go through. Before we move on, anyone have anything else on Grim Grimoire? The little strategy RPG that could.
I'd just like to say that I did buy the game, but I have not played it.
I think it's I think it'll surprise you as a nice breezy little play when you're just in the mood for. Vanillaware doesn't necessarily make really hard games, um, and that's something I think I like about them. Much like Dragon Quest, it's generally like a joyous, relaxing experience to play a Vanillaware game. Not always, certainly, but often. A month, as we kind of stated earlier, a month afterwards, Vanillaware released Odin Sphere, which kind of is what put Vanillaware on the map. Not only was this one a critical success, like Grim Grimoire, this one was actually a significant commercial success. Um, Enough financial success for Vanillaware not only to pay off their debts, but to continue making new games. As we stated before, this one was very much intended as a successor to Princess Crown. It still kept some of those fairy tale like elements, but at times leaned into Norse mythology, with you playing as a Valkyrie as your first main character, amongst many. But they did some interesting, I think, visual things with the Valkyries, like modeling them after ballerinas with the large kind of tutu like winged dresses that they wear and the very dainty artistic movement. Um, but maybe even more importantly than anything that this game did for Vanillaware is what it did for Vanillaware's food, because this was the first time that Vanillaware hired Takahiro Shiga, better known as Shigetake, as his artist name. He did all of the animation and design for the food in this game, and essentially became Vanillaware's food guru. Um, Anytime you see beautiful, just absolutely like mouth-watering food rendered in a Vanillaware game, it's probably Shigetake who did that, because they've kept him on. Um, he might have done more on the games, but as far as I can find, he is purely working on making their food look as good as possible in every single title he's contributed to.
Yeah, and he's also worked on a few indie games as well. So one game is Ass Libra Revision, which I actually did a review for. There's on the site, but that's like a side-scrolling action RPG that was made by a solo developer in his spare time over like a decade. And when they did the console or the re-release version that got a Western release and everything, that's a paid release. Shigetake did the art design for some of the bosses and enemies and stuff in that. And then also, I believe, just recently came out with a shmup called Devil Blade that I believe Shigetake developed entirely themselves.
What I don't want to get too off track, but I got to say one of the things that's most impressive about Shigetake's work on Ast Libra is that he manages to really evoke the original art style really well, while making it definitely feel like a more modern. You're gonna pay for this because this is a fully fleshed out game. Very talented artist. But I know all of us have some history with Odin Sphere. Um, Ben, do you wanna kick us off with a little bit about your history with Odin Sphere?
Yeah. So this is, I played Odin Sphere on the PS2 and I kind of bounced off of it just because there was a lot of, it's a very, it's the original version is a very beautiful game, but there's a lot of mechanical problems and game design issues, I would say, with just how the game is structured and progression and your, some of your abilities and things like that. But I really fell in love with the game with the release of Odin Sphere Leifthrasir, which is the remake that came out. I think in what it was like 2016, 2015, or 2016, for the PS3, the PS4, and the Vita, which is like a complete mechanical overhaul of the game. And then it updates the visuals for HD, and is just it's a sublime experience. It's just a huge improvement to the actual experience of playing the game, and it doesn't change any of the things that were good in the original. So the visual design and the storytelling and all of that is intact with minimal changes. Um, so yeah, it's one of my favorite games of all time for sure.
And it's really what put Vanillaware on the map, first and foremost. There are other games that elevated them, but this was definitely the first one where like people who weren't super niche gamers started to hear like, oh, there's something interesting happening. Even with all of its faults, it was still quite a success. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Vanillaware knows how to re-release and
Yeah.
remake or remaster a game. Because there were some real weaknesses in just playability with the original, and the remake just takes care of all of that without changing much of the stuff that mattered. I know that the team were kind of frustrated with the PS2 because the fidelity that they wanted out of the game had to be compromised to be able to work on the PS2. This whole thing was kind of a love letter to 2D as a still viable art form, which is something that Vanillaware still does today. But they were definitely handcuffed by how much the PS2 could render, and being able to redo it on the PS4 from their original artwork really shows you how Vanillaware's vision is meant to be seen, which is a rare thing to be able to do with an old game. So often they're intended for CRTs. So you remaster something like Chrono Trigger for PC, and you lose the way that it was meant to be seen a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great that they were able to go back and revisit the game and turn it into something that was like a flawed classic into like a 10 out of 10 experience. Yeah.
It's legitimately one of those that if you haven't played Odin Sphere, you owe it to yourself to play Odin Sphere.
Yeah, and it's crazy how ambitious of a game it is. I mean, you've got like I think five playable characters, and they each have their own like intersecting storylines, and it's just it was so ambitious. So it's not really surprising that it couldn't quite reach its full potential on the PS2, but um, definitely the remake is just elevates it to such a great game.
And each of those characters controls really uniquely. They each have
Mhm.
different, not just attack patterns, but their movement styles feel completely different from character to character.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's something that carries over into their later games too, and that was established here, which I think is really cool that they were able to put so many different gameplay styles in this game, even though it's a 2D action RPG, and the that kind of has its own limitations, but they're able to do so much even within those confines.
Actually, my first time through the game, I didn't enjoy it as much, and I think a big problem for me, I played the Leifthrasir version
mhm.
on the Vita, and like I think a big problem for me was it gets really repetitive, because
Yeah,
like
that's
Yeah, for sure.
absolutely true.
It is true,
yeah,
yeah.
like I just been through this map with Gwendolyn, and I'm doing it again with Oswald or something, and it's like you know I get why they gotta they can't just be making new assets all the time, but you know it just got a bit dull at some point. But I will say mechanically it's a very sound game. Like my favorite one to control was Oswald, because like he has like this Shadow Knight mode where he just goes crazy, like it's super fast paced, and it's just a lot of fun. And Mercedes was good too. Like she's the one whose levels like turn into a shmup, so it's like a bit more
Mhm.
exciting. Yeah. Yeah. So
Oswald also
yeah.
has the kind of design that, like, during the PS2 era, that's what sets you apart, because you
Yeah.
have the really cool guy
He's
with, like,
very
the silvery
edgy.
hair and the
Yeah,
black
very
armor.
edgy. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Bishonen, I think. But yeah, I just I think I've kind of turned around on it because like I did revisit it a bit before the episode, and I was like, hey, you know what? This is I missed this. Like I missed this. I missed the visuals. I missed the food. I missed this play style. I hope that if they ever if Vanova ever deigns to make a sequel to something, it would be this because I feel like an Odin Sphere 2 would be really something special.
But yeah, when you come back to it after a while, that repetitiveness almost kind of fades a little bit as you realize, once again, just how well the game plays.
Hmm. And there's so much variety with the additional playable characters. That you have these, all these different storylines, and the characters are all so vastly different. Like you were talking, Gio, about Mercedes, and she's a completely range character, and like plays just like totally differently from all the other characters who are mostly melee. And then Velvet, who is kind of like a mid-range character with her like whip chain stuff, weapon or whatever. And they just managed to make everybody feel so different, um, even with a relatively like simple control scheme and combat system. So I think that's what really saves it from being too repetitive. But it is true that there's a lot of repetition in the game, and that's a problem that I think a lot of their games have. Um,
Yeah. I thought the game was a little repetitive too, but not enough to like prevent me from moving on. So I did think things were getting a little repetitive through Leifthrasir. I also played Leifthrasir, uh, and there are points where it just gets a little repetitive. But I just found like the uniqueness of the characters and kind of what was going on narratively, kept me involved.
It's kind of one of the interesting things about Odin Sphere is it was conceived as a successor to Princess Crown, but specifically their focus was on evolving the narrative aspects of Princess Crown with this one.
Yeah, and the story is, I think, really, really good. And it is very like you were talking, Wes, about like that the background of kind of the world is that Norse mythology, and it is a very much like a folk tale style storytelling. And I think sometimes that style of narrative does, um, you know, is maybe a little harder to get into for some people, but I think it's very well executed, and you have a lot of like these powerful almost godlike forces warring against each other, and then the main characters are kind of caught in the middle of that, and it's like them trying to like deal with the ramifications of these like world encompassing world ending figures, doing battle and their machinations, and how they can kind of you know get to through their goals at the end of the world amidst all that. And it's just very compelling in a way that I think a lot of games don't try to do that kind of folktale style storytelling. And
Certainly
that's
not these
something,
days.
yeah, yeah, and that's something that Vanillaware I think does really well. And I think all the games that they've done really well with narrative in do have that style, like this game, and Muramasa in particular. Yeah.
And that's a pretty good point to segue, because where this was meant to play as an evolution to Princess Crown's story, Muramasa was developed as an evolution to Princess Crown's gameplay. Muramasa was the next game that they released. In many ways, it is similar to Odin Sphere and earlier Princess Crown and how its action plays out, but it's a much more dedicated focus on how your character moves, how your character behaves in combat, and it adds the extra wrinkle of having a vertical plane to explore. Um, Much like in earlier games, each room, so to speak, that you enter is a uniform, you know, border shape. But the platforms they're in and how enemies are placed within there are what make the different rooms you explore through unique. Um, Muramasa has at times by some been touted as something of a Metroidvania, but I think that's a little bit of a misnomer, because you're not doing that same let me unlock powers to unlock the next area that I go to. It's more about collecting keys and backtracking for that purpose. Um, it's more about the evolution of you as like a combat entity, with the rest of the exploration kind of giving a driving force through, focusing more on that action. Um, this one might be a little bit lesser known than some of the other games, simply because this is really the one we have right now that there is no way to play on a modern console. It was originally released on Wii and had a remake that released on Vita, and I want to say, I know it was released on Wii U. I don't know if that was in the West or only in Japan. Maybe one of you knows better than I.
Yeah, I think it's just the Wii and Vita releases. And the Wii release, is for the Western release in particular, is pretty compromised compared to the original, because they had issues, particularly with implementing the translation, um, and that like impacted how much text they could put into the boxes, and that was like a huge problem with the Wii version, and thankfully the Vita version fixed that. um, but yeah, I think it's just the Wii and Vita versions.
The Vita version's probably the best way to play. It's another one of Vanillaware's, highly touted remake, remasters, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, very few, except for like the kinds of enthusiastics that are on and that listen to this podcast, have a Vita sitting around, and fewer still are going to be able to find a copy of Muramasa to purchase. Ben, I know that this is another one that you have some good experience with. So can you kind of kick us off talking a little bit about it, since my experience with Muramasa is far more limited than any of the rest of Vanillaware's games?
Yeah, for sure. So, the story in Muramasa is much more based on Japanese folklore, and it kind of evokes that, traditional Japanese, art style of some of the traditional Japanese painting styles. So it's definitely still feels very Vanillaware, but the previous Vanillaware games leaned more on maybe a more Western fantasy aesthetic. So it's really cool that this game has more of an Eastern, traditional folklore aesthetic. And you have your two characters. So you have Momohime and Kisuke. Momohime is, her body is actually being possessed by a monk. So you have this interesting dynamic where he's like I think he's like a criminal. He's like a not a good dude, basically. And so she is like a soul accompanying her body that's being inhabited by him, and she is kind of tugged along on his, goals and journey, right? And then, Kisuke is, he was a ninja, and his ninja clan was basically like assassinated, and so he's trying to get like revenge for his ninja clan. And the characters both play very similarly. They both use swords, and that's kind of, one of the, I guess, drawbacks you would say of the original version of Muramasa in particular, compared to, let's say Odinsphere, where Odinsphere you had a lot of variety with the different characters, whereas here both characters play almost exactly the same. So if you want to experience both storylines, that can be very repetitive. But I think the storytelling is really interesting and fun. It has that unique kind of Japanese folklore style to it. So there's a lot of traditional Japanese folklore, yokai and things like that, those elements. And then Japanese folklore also has a lot of like things that like toilet humor and more kind of humorous or risque elements to it, and those are present in the story too, which kind of make things feel a little different from their other games.
And this definitely starts to lean into the direction that Vanillaware has definitely not been shying away from in future games, as we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
with you, Dragon's Crown.
Yes, but I will say it is very authentic to
Yes.
Japanese folklore. And the way that it's implemented here, it is like, it's authentic. Those, a lot of the folklore tales that they're pulling on do have those kind of, more body elements to them. So it feels a little more justified here maybe than their later work.
The number of yokai that specifically haunt toilets and toilet related
Yes.
entities
Yes.
is not as small as you would think it might be.
Yes. Absolutely.
How about the rest of you? Have you two, Gio and Nick, played Muramasa? Did you have any thoughts about how it kind of evolved Vanillaware's journey at all?
Well, for me, I have, but it's been so long ago. I know this is the first one I played, even before Odin Sphere, and um, I think I I liked it, but I also didn't it didn't really like grab me. It was more of like I played through the 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 lady character's path, and I was like, oh, I'm done. Like I don't feel the need to move on to the other route. And but I don't know. This was like a feast for the senses in terms of like like I was playing on Vita, and like the sushi really pops out on the screen or something, and I was like I just really enjoyed doing that. But it honestly, it's this is probably the game that I need to come back to, because I don't think I really truly appreciated it the first time around. So yeah, I think ben Ben went over stuff that I didn't really think about on my first time through. I didn't even notice like the toilet humor. So yeah, I'm gonna
Vanillaware,
check
you
it
could
out.
really make this easier on us by releasing a PS4 port of Rebirth.
Please.
That'd be great. I was the same as Gio. This was my first Vanillaware game, and like, I don't know, I was not noticing a lot of that stuff. But also, yeah, I played it on the actual Wii, so yeah, my memory of the game is limited.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with it not having a modern re-release. Is like how many of us have gone and dug up our Vitas to give this
Right.
another go in that time.
Yeah, and
Um,
I would recommend that both of you go back and revisit it though, and especially if you can play it on Vita and you can get the DLC, because that's like what really elevates this game. They did 4 DLC packs that are called the Genroku Legends, and each pack is an entirely different story, and they all feature an entirely different playable character that has a unique move set, totally different from the original 2 characters, and new mechanics to the combat and stuff. And that I think is like, that DLC. It's in my opinion some of the best DLC like released for any game ever. And the stories are a little shorter than like the main game stories, so they're like 3 or 4 hours long. But then you can go back and fight all the bosses from the original game, uh, with the new characters too. So there's like a lot of in-game content, and those storylines are really interesting. They're just as interesting as the main storyline, but they're a little more compact, so they're a little easier to digest. But yeah, I mean, I wish they would do a re-release because they could pack all that stuff in together. Because I even think some people go and they're like, oh, they got into Vanillaware with maybe Dragon's Crown or Unicorn Overlord, and even if they do go back and play Muramasa, they don't even know that the DLC exists, and that's like such a huge part of the appeal of this game.
Yeah, I remember that DLC because like when they used to do sales on Vita, those things used to go for pennies, like two
Hmm.
dollars, $1, and like I can't believe I passed on them because you make them sound so good, and like I mean, I still might buy them one day, but I'm really hoping for a remaster.
Yeah, I think they're only like they released at $5 each, so even to get all of it, it's only like $20, which is not that bad.
Oh,
is that
But
possible anymore with the PS
mhm.
Store?
Yeah, you can still buy Vita stuff on the store, and Muramasa was never delisted.
You just have
So
to do it from a Vita,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
right? You can't do it from the web or through the app.
that's
Gotcha.
correct. Yep, yep,
Um, is Muramasa available digitally? Because I just looked at the
yes.
physical prices and I am shook.
Yeah, it is. It is available digitally, and I think it got a price reduction. So it's not. I think it's like $20 for the main game, and then the DLCs are $5 each.
I
So
went
it's
to go
not.
check, but I mean, like, go figure. My Vita's dead.
Who would have guessed?
And probably has a big, thick layer of dust on it
I mean,
too.
it did. Now my shirt is covered in dust.
The number of Vanillawares I'm going to play after recording is non-trivial right now. We're hearing about all these the remakes that I haven't played all the way through all of those, and now I'm like, got a little bit of a homework to do.
Yeah,
Yes, I didn't know anything at all about that Muramasa DLC.
yeah. They really didn't like advertise it super well. And I think they did release like a bundle on the PS Store, but I mean, the Vita was kind of like dead by the time the last of the DLC came out. So I think a lot of people don't know about it. And I mean, I think if any game that we've talked about today deserves a re-release, it's this one, just because they could pack all that stuff in together. They could do it at a higher, do the game at a higher resolution than the Vita's, like 540p or whatever. So the art, the art would look so much better on, a modern console, and you could have that stuff all packed in. I think people would really like, view this game as one of their best, one of Vanillware's best.
Time is right, Vanillaware.
Yeah.
The next game in Vanillaware's history, we're not going to spend quite as much time on. Because the next game is the only game since they became known as Vanillaware. This group existed as a different company before, but this is the only Vanillaware Japan exclusive game that we really have to talk about. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. So, after Muramasa, and once again finding pretty solid crossover success, America will eventually, the West, I should say, the West will eventually become kind of vital to Vanillaware's continued success, but it's not quite there yet. And nowhere is that illustrated better than Grand Knight's history. Interesting in a lot of ways. For one, it moved away from action for the first time in Vanillaware's history, being more of a traditional turn-based RPG. But it was developed for the PSP with the idea of wireless communication being around for multiplayer, and as kind of part of the core as to how you build your knights party up. Um, the other really interesting thing about it, however, is that this was the first game in Vanillaware history not directed by George Kamitani. This was instead directed by Tomohiko Deguchi, um, who would uh, pretty soon after leave Vanillaware and use the lessons that he learned on Grand Knight's history to make a spiritual successor that did get released in the West, called Grand Kingdom. Well, not a Vanillaware game, and hence not discussed here. You can look it up. You can find our review on RPG Fan from back when it released. Um, there's plenty to talk about there, but real quick, anyone have anything that they want to note about Grand Knight's history? A game we never got, and to my knowledge, doesn't have a translation patch either.
It does actually have a fan
It
translation
does.
patch, yes, and
Oh
I have
wow.
played it. It's a really good game. I think if you have any experience with Grand Kingdom, they're like very similar, like
Yeah.
mechanically super similar. The main benefit of Grand Knight's history over Grand Kingdom is that the art is a lot better in Grand Knight's history because you had the full, Vanillaware studio artists working on
Mhm.
it. Grand Kingdom looks. I mean, I think Grand Kingdom looks good. It has good 2D art, but it's nowhere near
Yeah.
the art in Grand Knight's history. And it's a fun game. As a single player game, like, it definitely was made for multiplayer and online play, so you're not going to get the full experience just playing it single player, but it's worth experiencing just because the visuals are so good and the gameplay is pretty tight and interesting. And it's interesting to play this and then compare it to Unicorn Overlord, which it's probably the most similar to of
Yeah.
all the games that Vanillaware's made. And it's interesting that they took lessons from this game for that game, despite Deguchi being the director of this one and then leaving. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're a big Vanillaware fan, it's worth downloading the translation patch and giving it a try. But unfortunately, you can't get the full experience without online. So
It seems like definitely it's not only like focused on online, it's focused on online as a Japanese developed PSP game, and the wireless communication scene there is wildly different than what you can get in 99% of America.
Yeah.
So it's definitely the intended experience is not something I think you can really experience, but there's still a lot to see there. Um, I'm glad for some reason I didn't find the translation patch when I was doing my research, so I'm actually really happy to hear that. And this might be added to my list as well, just for completionist's sake. But again, since that one comes with an asterisk recommendation, we're gonna fly pretty quickly over to their next game, the one that really made the West an important variable in Vanillaware's future, um, Dragon's Crown. A lot of you have probably heard of this, played this. This is yet another one where we got an updated port, making it playable on modern consoles. Originally, it was designed as yet another follow-up to Princess Crown, which might help you understand why we had to talk about Princess Crown at least briefly at the beginning. um, but their original publisher, UTV Ignition, was really interested in multiplayer, which started to kind of veer this further away from Princess Crown and further toward like a beat 'em up, an old style Capcom style arcade beat 'em up direction. Eventually, the publisher would change to Atlas, but this direction was pretty well locked in by that point. Um, and it took a lot of inspiration from a few similarly RPG infused beat 'em ups. Um, Maybe the most recognizable stated influences are the D&D arcade games that we spoke about earlier, as well as the well-beloved arcade and Super Nintendo classic King of Dragons. Um, Both of those are noteworthy because they're beat 'em ups where you progress your character throughout the course of your beat 'em up campaign, which is rare. It's not unheard of. There are a few games that do this, but it's pretty rare. And Vanillaware further layered this by adding in a loot system inspired by Diablo, which made the replayability go off the charts for people who are absolute loot monkeys. Um, and it's got this interesting structure where basically your entire first playthrough of the game is more tutorial than anything, and then you unlock this mode where you kind of randomly go to harder and harder versions of those stages. You can take alternate paths. You can find new growth opportunities for your characters and have little bits of story expand. Although, really, once you beat that first playthrough, the majority of the story is out of the way for quite a while. Um, but this was a huge success, especially in the West, where beat 'em ups never quite died out, where people still adore their times with games like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, the Simpsons game, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, all kinds of beloved beat 'em ups from the era when arcades were actually viable. Um, this is I don't want to say necessarily that it's my favorite Vanillaware game, but it is up there as an experience. It might be the most fun that I've had with a Vanillaware game, um, even if I like others more, because Dragon's Crown is really meant to be played with friends, in my opinion. It works at its best when you have a reliable crew who is constantly playing with you and constantly leveling up with you. Even if you have to fill in the gaps with some randos from the internet to fill out your full 4-person party, which Dragon's Crown does seamlessly. Um, it's got a lot of things going for it, not only in like the loot grind and adding skills and new weapons and armor to your characters. Um, but maybe this might be my favorite iteration of Vanillaware food in the entire history of the developer. After stages, you set up camp for the night and you see this display in front of you of various meats and veggies and fruits. And it's kind of this race situation where you and everyone in the party grabs food as quickly as possible, putting it into their cooking dish and trying to make a really good meal that will help give you buffs and boosts for future stages. And the things that you get as ingredients are based on the things that you killed in that stage. Like usually a boss that you beat will have a special ingredient on there. And the food is so lovingly rendered. And not only that, it's rendered in raw form, partially cooked form, and then as an entire dish based on the other things that you added with it. It is maybe the greatest food porn that Vanillaware has put out thus far. Although I am open to differing opinions. But ultimately, it's satisfying in that consistent growth that you get with a looter RPG, combined with the moment to moment gameplay of a beat 'em up game, which for me is timeless. For others, I understand not so much. The crossover between RPG fans and beat 'em up fans might not be as pronounced as it seems with me. So I'm definitely interested in hearing what you all have as experiences with Dragon's Crown, because I know for at least one of you, this is not your favorite Vanillaware release.
Well, I loved it. I've played a lot of Dragon's Crown because I'm currently trying to get the Platinum Trophy in it, and Dragon Crown's Pro. Uh, and I think a lot of the combat mechanics, I'm not super I'm not huge into the incredibly long campaign where you complete it and then have to grind for like 4 hours before you get to the actual ending. If I'm remembering that correctly.
No, that's right.
That's about right.
correct.
Yeah.
Okay. But I really enjoy the combat mechanics, the ability to upgrade your character, the character that you're playing. I also like the online party feature. It's a little wonky to like get set up, but once you actually have people in your party, running missions with you, it's very smooth and very fun.
And it's interesting. Since you mentioned all the characters, this game does have, I want to say, 6 character classes. Am I wrong? 5?
No, I think you have
It's
the fighter, dwarf, elf,
Elf is who I was missing in my
the
brain.
wizard, and the sorceress, and the
And the Valkyrie.
Amazon.
Yeah, the
Yep.
Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they all play at least in some ways different from each other. They have different unique abilities, and some of them have different weapons. The sorceress and the wizard are a little bit more, have more overlap than any other two of the classes. Um, but it's kind of impossible to talk about those characters without talking about the big controversy that Dragon's Crown faced, which was the extremely exaggerated character designs of the game. Especially the women were the ones that turned more than a few heads, as this is definitely the thirstiest of Vanillaware's ouvre. Kamitani in rare form on this one. He caught a lot of flack, especially in the West, because of over sexualized character designs. And I'm not going to plant a flag in the ground on this one. I don't think that's a viable use of our time.
Yeah,
It's
it's interesting because I mean I think most fans of JRPGs, the main character designs, I think are probably all things that you've pretty much seen before. Yeah, they are a little exaggerated, but it's pretty typical. I think really the worst aspects of that are more further into the game. There's some scenes, there's this one scene with a cleric that's
It's like a nun,
really,
right?
oh yeah,
yeah, which is really kind of skeevy.
it's
And
definitely skeevy. Yeah,
yeah,
I knew
and there's,
exactly what you were talking about the second you brought
everyone
it up.
instantly had the
yeah,
image in their head.
yeah, and
even if they didn't remember it.
yeah, and then the controversy was not about that. I think because the people who were reacting to things they saw from the promotional material, and they didn't really play the game far enough to even get to that content.
Mm.
But there definitely are some less savory elements in some of the art design and depictions further in the game. And I do think that kind of detracts from the experience a little bit. But most of, overall, I think the art design is really wonderful in the game. And you just have to know going in that there are some of those elements. And I mean, that's a big caveat with a lot of
Yes.
RPGs. So yeah.
It definitely comes from, the roots of all of the art in this game are Gygax era D&D, which has its own problematic elements, and then this is
Mhm.
those jacked up, exaggerated, taken to the nth degree. So this is a game that I hardly recommend from a gameplay perspective, but as far as those questionable materials, I would never bash anyone for deciding, nah, that ain't for me. You need to take that caveat and that warning that, yeah, there is some questionable content in here, and whether or not you can deal with that to get to the juicy center is purely a personal choice. Silence.
Oh.
Anyway.
I mean, like, yeah, you nailed it.
Anyone
Yeah.
have anything else on Dragon's
I
Crown
was gonna
before I
wait
move
for
on?
Geo to talk before I said anything else.
No, I just started Dragon's Crown like yesterday.
Oh
So
wow.
yeah, and I really like it. I think the only disappointing thing so far is that I think you have to unlock the multiplayer or on the
Yes.
online,
Hmm.
and
You
it's like a ways in. I don't know how long, but like I wanted to play with friends, but yeah,
yeah
that's not
you
happening for a while.
You technically have to beat the game once.
mhm.
Oh no.
Which is I think bonkers that they didn't change that in Pro.
Yeah, it's like 6 to 8 hours before you can unlock the multiplayer.
Yeah.
Because the wildest thing is there is a workaround. I played the entire first playthrough of the game with two of my friends because they were sitting on the couch with
Yeah,
me.
the local
And
co-op.
local
Yeah.
co-op is there from the get-go. But if you want to play online, you literally have to beat the game first, which is a decision they made.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate, especially it was an unfortunate decision in the PS3 era. It's a doubly unfortunate position now that, like, especially in a post-COVID world, everything is remote. Everyone is doing everything without being in the same room as their friends. It would be really nice to be able to just dig into this game for the first time, with a friend that doesn't necessarily live down the block from you. We are all a lot older. We have other priorities. A lot of the friends we make aren't next door neighbors.
Yeah. The one nice thing about the online, I will say, is that the Pro version on the PS4 is cross-play with the PS3 and Vita versions,
Which is
Yes.
which is
crazy.
yeah, yeah, because it was like I think it was released like 8 years after the original release, and it's still cross-play. So like, there's still an online community for the Vita and PS3 version now, because they are play. You can play with PS4 people, and the game is like basically identical. So yeah, you don't lose out on the experience at all playing on the older platforms.
It's
Yeah, turns out what makes it pro is that it can run on a PlayStation 4.
And it is higher resolution. It's like 1080p, or maybe it does like 2 or 4K or something like that. But I think that's the main benefit of the PS4 version. Yeah.
it's astounding because it has those built-in player bases from people on older consoles and whatnot too. You can still have a very robust online matchmaking experience with Dragon's Crown even now,
Mm-hmm.
which you can't say about a lot of games that are that old. Even the PS4 version is getting long in the tooth at this point.
Yeah, yeah. For me, Dragon's Crown is definitely my least favorite Vanillaware game, and I think the main reason for that is mostly the some of the elements we talked about earlier, and then the lack of narrative. Like there really isn't like a
Mhm.
cohesive driving narrative to the game. Um, and I can kind of understand because it's got a multiplayer focus why they went in that direction, but I think that's a major part of what I like about all of Vanillaware's other games, and that's just missing here. But the core gameplay is really fun, and there's a lot of variety with all the different playable characters. And if you really like beat 'em ups, I mean, this is one of the best modern ones for sure. So there's a lot to enjoy about it.
The beginning of the game has like it seems like they're setting up something pretty interesting with
Mhm.
like I think it's like the prince and the princess are fighting, and like the wizard, or not the wizard, like one of the shopkeepers is like sending you out on a mission, and they're like, oh, you have to check in with the castle, and you're
There's
doing
some
work
court
for
intrigue
us.
to be had, and
There's just, it seems like they're setting up a whole bunch of stuff, and they never really goes anywhere.
Yeah, and like the narrative that there, it's almost like in the style of like D&D, like you're in a dungeon and then you happen upon like a character, and then there's like a thing that happens, and then like that's it.
Yeah.
So it's very old school in that way, which I can get what they were going for, but it's just a different choice, and it just doesn't vibe with me as much as some of their other stuff.
maybe the best thing that we can say about Dragon's Crown, for players like Ben and other story focused players, is that its wild international success left Vanillaware in a position to experiment like hell with the final two games on our list, and do really truly special games with um, perhaps their best narrative ever in their next game, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Kamitani described this as a recklessly ambitious game, and it absolutely is. It's also interesting in that scrapped ideas from Grim Grimoire's sequel narratives were tied in to make the unique story structure of 13 Sentinels. Um, for those of you that have not heard of 13 Sentinels, it's somewhere between an adventure game, a visual novel, and a tower defense slash RTS game. It's got elements of all of those, but combines into something that is pretty dang unique, even amongst what we would consider its peers. Um, they made a few interesting changes to some of the formulas that they were reusing, especially in the strategy portion of the game, because essentially you progress the story, and every once in a while you're gated by these strategy battles that take place near the end of the narrative of the primary game. So you're kind of getting like little bits of the story and the lore of the world peppered in from earlier and later, and you've got so many different characters that are interweaving in these plots, slowly unveiling the truth of the world. Um, but they've engineered it in this really unique way where no matter what order you do it in, there are always really cool cliffhangers to end on for dang near every chapter that you play. Perhaps most interesting, what they did to the gameplay at least, was they took gameplay kind of inspired by Grim Grimoire's RTS systems. Um, but RTS games, and once again, they mentioned StarCraft as a major inspiration here, are not as popular in Japan. So they decided to add really strong elements of tower defense, which is a much more popular genre in Japan. So these strategy games still play out where you're deploying units and doing um, interesting space control, but it's all based around this central tower that you're protecting the entire time. This ended up being a really ambitious mix of genres, which led to slow sales at first. This was one of their slower selling games, but word of mouth on this thing was absolutely ridiculous. The tail on the sales for this game, the amount of copies it sold over time, was tremendous. They hit 2 million sales years after their release. Years after their release, it was, and this was one of the first times we got a port, in this case to Switch, that didn't really add a whole lot. It added a few little things, changed up some of the balance things, but it wasn't as significant of a rework as something like Leifthrasir or Rebirth. Geo, I know you've got a lot of love in your heart for 13 Sentinels. You wanna kick us off a little bit, talking about this wonderful entry?
Yeah. I mean, you went over like the basic overview. It's kind of like this really sophisticated sci-fi story that somehow maybe close to perfectly melds point and click adventure gameplay with uh, RTS tower defense ish um, system. Like basically, like the game is like you jumping around different characters like stories, and then interspersed with like maybe a couple of missions of you uh, doing those like RTS missions. And for me, I just loved how you know how the story kind of like the places the story went, and it's kind of also like this love letter to like the sci-fi movies we watched growing up. Name a name, you name it, like Terminator or Macross. Even actually, one of the probably the centerpiece of this whole game is like somewhere in the middle. Like there's like this tribute to the end of Macross. I'm sorry to spoil it now, but it's for me, it's like one of my favorite scenes, like in any game, and my favorite sequences. And uh, it's really beautiful what they came up with. It's like they were juggling um, all these little threads, and I was worried that at the end it would all kind of fall apart. But I don't know. I don't know. Kamitani is a genius, I guess, and
This is maybe the best showcase of that.
yeah, yeah. I was really impressed by how it all came together. And I will also say this is like probably the high watermark in terms of like Vanillaware soundtracks. I think Base Escape kind of knocked it out of the park here. It did the strategy themes are really propulsive, and it really helps. It really adds to the mood, like when you're doing like doing these like spectacular like light show RTS missions, and yeah, I it's like the kind of game I don't really want to spoil too much if for people who haven't played it, but yeah, for me it definitely lived up to the expectations that had built up. Like the word of mouth, like you said, for this game was crazy by the end. Like even Yoko Taro and Sakurai, Masahiro Sakurai, were like saying, "Please play this game. It's amazing." And like so I was a bit skeptical, but it was it was as good as they said for me. It was really great. And if you're like worried about like if the story is gonna make sense to you, because like there is like a lot of um little details. Like, but the cool thing about this game is like there's like a really comprehensive glossary that you can like refer to at any time. It's like kind of like a precursor to what they did in Final Fantasy 16, like with like the you know the lore that you can like look up anytime. It's kind of the same thing here, and I'm just when you read through, it's like it's really impressive how they managed to like patch up any possible plot hole in the game. And yeah, I was like, I think Vanillaware should do more stuff like this. I think they're actually very good at putting narratives together.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most impressive things is that so often their games are built on some reference to the past, like built as a loving new version of something that people loved in the past. You know, whether you're talking about Starcraft or Princess Crown or Ogre Battle, so many of their games are love letters to what are in the past, and this one wears its inspirations on its sleeves throughout all of, as you talked about, both implicit and explicit references to sci-fi in every medium possible. Um, this game loves sci-fi, but it manages to never let that be the main story. It's never so referential that that becomes the point of it. It is quite simply, this game loves sci-fi and manages to love it as a fan while simultaneously telling one of the greatest sci-fi stories in the modern era. Um, I do need to throw out a quick correction. It definitely was 1 million that they passed. Um, the game released in Japan in 2019, and the Switch version released in 2022, and then they crossed over 1 million units in 2023. So this game continues to push units because that word of mouth, the reputation that it's granted, um, means new people are always discovering it. And God, if we can help one person discover 13 Sentinels through this podcast, our work here is done, right?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I know Ben hasn't really played through it yet, but like he has high standards when it comes to like strategy RPG. So I hope like the strategy part of this game appeals to him.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
got
I
to
haven't
fix this, Ben.
I haven't said much because this is the only Vanillaware game that I haven't played. And yeah, the main reason is just like when it first came out, like I don't really play adventure games or visual novels on the TV, and it was only on PS4, so that was like a big issue for me. But I do have the Switch version, and that's probably the version I'll play. And the other thing that put me off about it was just like the like naked teenagers in the mechs kind of thing. But I know, like, I mean, I'm a big Evangelion fan, and that has like the same problems. And I've heard so many good things about this game that I know I have to play it. So, I'm definitely, and Geo is always raving to me about how great this game is. So, I'm definitely going to give it a try, and I'm sure I'll like it a lot.
It's kind of a weird trope, Japan, but my God, is it a good game? I will back up the chorus from Geo on this one. This is probably, God, it's so hard to say, but this might be my favorite in Vanillaware's history. Just because the story is so next level. The presentation is so good. And I'm a sucker for mecha. What can I say?
I forgot about the teenagers having to nude up in the mechs.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
surprise.
good. That's good because it
Maybe.
means that it's not a super like in your face important thing in the game that much. So it's probably easy to
Yeah.
look past. Yeah.
Or my brain blocked it out.
This might have
Because
been a
that is
self-preservation
weird.
thing.
Yeah. I'm just like sitting here right now going like, oh yeah, that's right. Oh, that was so weird. But yeah, that game's incredible. The the story is just like it had me hooked the whole way through. Tower defense guy, I guess. Um, I really found the strategy sections to be a lot of fun. I think the strategy session, well, the genre bending and the mashup as well. I think turns some people off. I have a friend who refuses to play it because he does not like the story gates, where like you'll be going
Mm,
along in the story and then you have to do a strategy thing.
Mm.
we got to fix that person.
I mean, like it's a bizarre complaint to make. Most games are kind of built that way.
Yeah, but I guess if you're used to like visual novels or like adventure games, I guess that could be like a pretty big like barrier because most games in that style are more like just giving you the narrative at
Yeah.
your own
Yeah.
pace. Yeah.
Yeah, because like I will say like the narrative's like a bit of a page turner, and like I have heard that complaint before, and it's like they're saying like, well, like the battles kind of interrupt the pace of the story, and I understand why, but for me actually like I almost prefer the battle side of things, like the like I don't know, I just found it really fun.
Definitely.
It's also extremely breakable because like one of the powers, the sentry gun, is like super busted. So,
Sentry gun is so
yeah,
busted. That's all I did.
yeah,
Sentry guns and drones, and then just sit back and let the game win itself.
yep.
And it's not like
So
the strategy sections are bereft of narrative, though, right? Like
That's what
yeah,
really appealed to me.
yeah,
Was you're getting that future narrative, so you're seeing a completely different angle of where this story is going. That you almost can't imagine based on the opening of the game that it's going to get there.
right.
So it was always nice at like kind of double headering that mystery to me, but I know that's
mm.
not going to be everyone's experience.
And I will say like the game is like progressive in other ways that were
Absolutely.
surprising to me that I won't spoil. But yeah, it, it it pushes the envelope, pushes the envelope. That's all I'll say.
Uh, Definitely had some moments that made my heart very happy. That might be a spoiler depending on how much someone knows about me. I get the feeling we could do an entire episode just on spoiler casting 13 Sentinels. And hey, maybe we'll get there someday. Maybe they have, and I didn't even realize it. I'm not sure. Um, but that leads us to the most recent game by Vanillaware. And by their own marking, the biggest game that they have built to date in Unicorn Overlord, which just came out. God, that was this year, wasn't it, y'all?
Sure
Yeah.
was.
I know it's hard to believe, right? It feels like it was like a year ago.
It released this year, but it's like 700 RPGs back.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
This has been
exactly.
a
Yeah.
bonkers year for RPG fans,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and now we're going into October and there's like 7 really good RPGs coming out in the next like 20 days, which is nuts.
I've got to say, Unicorn Overlord either is in my top 3 of the year or is my top game of the year. This
Mhm.
might be,
Damn.
yeah, unless Metaphor, Dragon Age, or Dragon Quest like absolutely blow me out of the water even more than I'm expecting them to. Unicorn Overlord's my game of the year as of right now. Um, this is another one, the second game that was not directed by George Kamitani. Directed by someone who's primarily worked as an artist and occasionally as a programmer at Vanillaware, Takafumi Noma, who also took over character design work for Unicorn Overlord, explaining why the art style is a little bit different, even if that Vanillaware sheen is over everything that kind of makes it all cohesive. And even had to step in to help with programming to the point where he was also the lead programmer. So Noma kept busy on this project. Kamitani primarily provided support and constant input, as Noma and his team, iterated on the concepts of the game, which they described as just doing whatever felt right at the time and adjusting. Like it was, they describe it as almost like a slapdash experience, but they had this really lofty vision, and it went through multiple prototypes, each of which they describe as its own fully different game. But ultimately, um, going through so many revisions, and making the conscious decision that we are going to not cut our scope in any significant way. We are going to get damn near everything we want in the game, meant that it drained Vanillaware's coffers completely, and actually led Kamitani to self-fund the last leg of development out of his own pocket. But this was intended as an homage, as a successor to the tactical games of the 90s, trying to bring them and make them more accessible to a modern audience. And while they have been very careful not to name names, Ogre Battle exists. So, Um, but once again, this is one that's seen huge success and is assuring us that yet again we're gonna get another Vanillaware masterpiece that is ride or die. That's gonna have to be a success, or else Vanillaware is gonna fold yet again. Um, but Unicorn Overlord, we can talk a lot about Unicorn Overlord. And Nick, I haven't picked on you yet, so I want you to kick us off talking a little bit about what Unicorn Overlord is, and what you thought of it.
Well, what it is, well, you already described what it is, right? Um, it's it's hard for me because like I think of Ogre Battle. I don't think I've ever played. Yeah, I don't think I've ever played an Ogre Battle game. Um, so this was kind of a different experience for me. Um, it's interesting that the Grand Knight's history was in Vanillaware's. I didn't even know that game existed. Um, but like this game, like the layout of like fighting, um, uh, when when I first saw the promotional material, reminded me of Grand Kingdom. Kind of like just seeing the enemy on the left. It's kind of like a 2D landscape with the enemy on the left and your guys on the right.
The composition of your units is very similar, where you have like a unit is actually like 5 characters kind
Mhm.
of arranged that way. That is, yeah, it's exactly how Grand Kingdom works, but the actual gameplay is different when you're in battle. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. You're not, because if I recall correctly, in Grand Kingdom, you're actually controlling each
that's correct.
individual.
And it's
Yeah,
turn based. Yeah, it's
and
turn
it's turn
based, and
based.
you're
Yeah,
directly controlling everything. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so I thought Unicorn Overlord was really good. um,
Good take. I approve.
I was hooked immediately, and I figured I would be. It just kind of seemed like my specific flavor, and it was. Um, but the thing that probably stands out the most to me is the art. I think the art is phenomenal.
It really
I,
was.
the game is gorgeous the whole way through. Um, and like even on places where things didn't need to look particularly good, um, like just like random buildings on the overworld.
Yeah.
Everything still looks. I mean, like it's just so beautifully done, and they took a lot of care to fill things in and make it look good, but like to be expected from Vanillaware, right?
How satisfying is it with those towns on the overworld when you can go and like help rebuild them and you see them, like, especially the ones that have 3 different stages, and you'll see, like, that ruined tower is repaired, and then this building has a new storefront, and you see those towns rebuild as you donate materials to them.
Just beautiful.
Oh, it kills me. I love it.
Literally taken aback by some of the art.
Mhm.
And I thought it was also pretty good narratively, which surprised me because I just assumed that, like, after playing, I don't know, I guess I just assumed that, like, a lot of games like that are gonna be a little light on the story.
Mhm.
And no, this one was um very good. There were
Compelling,
parts,
you know?
but yeah, like, very compelling. Made me want to keep moving on, even though, like, the completionist in me was very intent on doing everything I could on the map before moving on.
Carried in a lot of ways by some of its characters. The relationship mechanics and how you can see bonds grow between those characters. Um, the fact that you have to make choices about some of those growths, and just getting to know your units. Your units become their personalities as you build them up and kind of intermix. Well, I think this character would go best with this character, which is entirely how I played the game. It was a vibes based party meta. I would try to make relatively balanced parties, but I was far more worried about, like, well, she has to be with her brother, of course. I mean, they look after each other, and oh, this is
Yeah,
the romantic interest that I'm really most interested in. So clearly, they have to be together to build that bond in battle, right?
yeah. To me, this game, I'm a huge fan of tactical RPGs. It's my favorite genre, and my favorite series is Fire Emblem, and my favorite probably individual creator developer is Yasumi Matsuno, who is
Yep.
the creator of Tactics Ogre and Ogre Battle. And so this game to me is it's almost like laser focused on like everything I like, because if I had to describe what is Unicorn Overlord, it is the gameplay of Ogre Battle, like almost exactly one to one the gameplay of Ogre Battle, with the storytelling and character archetypes and relationship mechanics and that sort of thing of Fire Emblem. Um,
Absolutely.
Almost a carbon copy in many ways, actually,
Yeah.
of the character archetypes storytelling from Fire Emblem. But and I think some people who are fans of Ogre Battle going into this game were a little disappointed about the narrative side, because Matsuno does very deep,
Hmm.
politically deep and intriguing narratives that are maybe a little more higher brow than what you get in Fire Emblem. But for me, I really love those kind of classic sword and sorcery, uh, prince rising up to take back his kingdom kind of stuff that you get in Fire Emblem. So it didn't really bother me, and I don't mind the character focus as opposed to the more plot focused thing that you get with a typical Matsuno game. So I really enjoyed every aspect of this game. Like you guys are saying, I think that the interplay between building, the kind of preparation and progression aspects, where you're building up your units and you're making these different little groups or battalions, if you will, of each unit, and then how the characters and the relationships factor into how you're building those, is just really addicting. And I also like how there's a degree of non-linearity to
Hmm.
the construction of the game, especially at the
Absolutely.
beginning. That first area in the middle part of the map that you're in, you kind of have free reign to go wherever you want and tackle all the towns or whatever in whatever order. And then after that, it kind of takes you to different locations a little more linearly, but you still have a lot of freedom in how you approach each area and what you want to focus on, which I think is really cool. And that's something that Fire Emblem doesn't do, that Ogre Battle does to a certain extent, but that this game does to a much greater degree, um, which makes it really, really compelling. And sets it apart from its inspirations, even though it wears those inspirations on its sleeve. It is still a unique experience. And yeah, I loved it.
I think maybe the greatest thing it brings to the battle that Ogre Battle doesn't is the tactics that you can set for your entire party.
Hmm.
This almost like FF12 Gambit system, Dragon
Yes.
Age tactics
Yeah.
system, hierarchy of commands and target types and conditions. That makes this, you can spend more time organizing your
Hmm.
your tactics than your units. in a lot of ways, and probably have higher, like bigger impacts on the outcome of battle.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that's the difference between, having a tough time with a battle or breaking the game completely wide open is
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
system where you're determining like you're saying like Final Fantasy 12 gambits. I can't remember exactly what they're called in Unicorn Overlord, but yeah, setting those behaviors or parameters for your units, like that is, you can get really really granular, and that makes such a huge, I mean, you'll like set your units up and they'll go and it'll preview the battle right before it happens, or it has like a little window and it tells you like what
Yes,
the result will be.
it's
And
deterministic in a very
yes,
nice way.
yes, and then so you know exactly what's going to happen, but then you can make some edits or changes to your unit behaviors and it will be a completely different result. And like that level of like, oh, I'm going to do these very very small, seemingly small changes and get such a huge result. Like I don't know any other game that's really done that.
Mhm.
And it makes it really addicting.
And one of the things I love about the game too is, less this scare off more casual tactical fans, because I was never a big Ogre Battle fan. I was a big Fire Emblem fan, big Shining Force fan. I like
Hmm.
um, games that I can kind of control the levers on and really determine how challenging I want my experience to be. And I think this game does it beautifully, because if you play on the easiest level, there is still, you will still have to adjust your units to properly handle things, but you will rarely have to go into the tactics to adjust, outside of the default that it sets. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and I think what you're talking about, Wes. Like you have that balance between the real time element and then the element like actually in battle, and that micromanaging real time element stays compelling throughout the game, even when you have the like really broken unit setups. When they're actually in unit to unit combat, so that keeps you from just like completely zoning out. Like you guys were talking about with 13 Sentinels, which I haven't played, but you're talking about, oh, I'm just going to set up my survey guns or drones or whatever is going to do it for me. You can't really do that in this game. You have to be micromanaging where your units are going and covering all of your areas on the map and making sure your base isn't getting attacked and things like that. So you have to maintain like an active role at all times, and even if you're playing on easy, that stuff is fun and engaging.
mhm. I love a game with an easy mode that doesn't remove your need to interact to engage with game mechanics completely. That is, in my mind, what a good easy mode is. And even the normal mode is not particularly difficult. You don't have to get deep into
Hmm.
uh, the weeds with it. But you have harder difficulties available from the beginning that really do push you to really engage with the systems. And I think that's the right slider. Is like, how deeply do you want to engage? But we're never going to let you pull out completely and just turn your brain off.
Hmm. Yeah, and even on those hard difficulties, like if you really get into the like setting your unit parameters and behaviors and stuff, you will eventually like make the unit to unit battles a cakewalk. But
Absolutely.
because there's enough of that additional like meta layer of micromanaging in the RTS part, it's still, and you've got like there's like ballista or there's like people, all those kind of things like siege weapons and yeah, like there's all these little things that they add and they keep adding throughout the whole game. You just keep adding these new elements and it just really keeps things fresh and enjoyable.
And it really does start very simple to understand, and then you add things like, unit orders, or I
Hmm.
forget what they're called, um, where like maybe you have a Griffin rider and can double the speed at which you move.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, those things you can get the unit abilities on the map. Those are like also such a huge aspect of this game. And managing your resources, that because you have like a global amount of resources for your whole army that those abilities pull from. So it's like, well, who should use their ability now and why, and then who you set as the leader determines what you can, which abilities you're pulling from. It's just like really, I mean, we could talk about this game forever, but there's a lot of strategy to it, and I think anybody who really likes digging into like game systems would love this game.
And for filthy casuals like me, there are beautiful class upgrades. There's so much good
Hmm.
character art, so many shinies, so many points of progression, so many little side quests that unlock as like you get the right character archetype, and so many things to collect everywhere. But it's all done in this really quick, thoughtful, responsive way. So like, it's worth it to go harvesting materials, but it never feels like a big to do.
It's not a chore. Yeah.
hmm it's swift. It's you see a big shiny thing, you don't have to keep your eyes peeled and move slower. You go grab that thing, it doesn't break your stride, or at least not much, and you're constantly uncovering new things and new classes and new ways to play. um, this is why this is the first game in years that I spent, dozens of hours on, and still happily would have played dozens more. Like it was I very rarely have a game that I finish and went like, man, I wish that was longer, especially a game that's this long to begin with.
Yeah, there was tons to do in that game.
Yeah, and it has that replayability factor that you get out of really good strategy RPGs. You can use focus on different units, and you can pull out a different route through the game, and you'll get a different experience every time.
Get married to someone different.
Yeah.
Who did you guys
And
get married to?
I was a big Melisandre stan the entire time. I don't know, I respected her.
yeah, I went with Charlotte, the cleric girl that you start with.
Kind of
Nice.
the canon.
Yeah.
I want to ask though, is it true that the best girl to marry is your cousin?
That's who I got married to.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
honestly,
she's a
kind
cool
of.
character.
She's amazing
She's a cool
character.
character.
No,
yeah.
she rules.
There are not only are there all kinds of cool unit types, like unique characters, that come out of it, like your Habsburg line cousin, freaking beautiful designs, really interesting characters. Um, it would be a spoiler to talk about probably my favorite, but let's say she's got a big axe, big shield, will travel.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely
and
baller
like
unit.
the way you have to get her is like a really interesting part of the game. Too that requires a lot of, especially if you're in hard, a lot of like min maxing.
I was heartbroken when I realized I missed exactly one character on my playthrough, because I went guide free and was feeling real good. And then I realized that there was a choice you had to make between a couple of furries, and there was a choice to get them both.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, we didn't even really talk about that, but there's like actual narrative choice with severe consequences in this
Absolutely.
game too. Yeah. So that part is very, Ogre Battle, Matsuno. So if you like those games, there is that element of it too, and it's pretty satisfying as well.
And it's definitely got that Fire Emblem concept of um, unique circumstances with which to recruit characters, and having
Yeah.
those nice little tie together text bits at the end that tell you like what happened to that character that might change depending on some of the choices that you made during the game.
Yep. 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 It is a incredibly fully featured game. Like there's no element of it that is like lacking in polish or attention to detail. It's pretty incredible, honestly, that they were able to release something like that in a genre that they really don't do. They've dabbled in, but it hasn't been their focus. There's studios that have spent their whole life making strategy RPGs, and Vanillaware comes in and like blows it out of the park with like their first real attempt at it, which is pretty mind-blowing.
Pretty embarrassing for the guys that spent their entire lives on it, though.
Well, I mean, look, most studios will never be Vanillaware. They got the special sauce, right? So you can't hold yourself up to that standard.
That's how I feel, though. I feel like they'll just I'm convinced they can do anything.
Yeah.
Like they'll tackle any genre and they'll just knock it out of the park.
Well, and this is interesting. We probably weren't going to talk about this game, but have you guys ever heard of their Fantasy Earth Zero? Do you guys know what that
Yes.
is? Okay. I don't know if you were going to bring that up, Wes, but
I was gonna leave it because it wasn't technically a Vanillaware project. It was when they were Puraguru, or
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact name of that. But it is worth bringing up, I think, with where we've reached in the conversation.
Because that is that if you're not familiar with it, it is a MMO that they worked before they were Vanillaware. Their initial Kamatani's initial like studio that he formed, they worked on this game, and they didn't see it through to the end, but they established the art design and a lot of the mechanics and everything, and then it had to be finished with another studio because they just weren't able to complete it. But it was published by Square Enix, and it came out in Japan in 2006, and it did actually have a Western release in 2010. So like 4 years later, and it was on Square Enix's like Play Online that they used for Final Fantasy 11. But I think it was only active for like a year
Yeah,
in
it
the
was a brief.
West. Yeah. So I've never played it, and most people never played it, but you can find gameplay videos and stuff. It's really kind of interesting, and it has that Vanillaware art design. But yeah, they worked on an MMO too. So
And stop me if you've danced to this song before, but they did take a lot of design elements from Princess Crown and
Mhm,
pull them into that MMO as they were
mhm.
working on it, including actual design concepts that had been in mind that weren't used for Princess Crown.
Yep, yep.
It's a retro encounter episode. I gotta ask y'all an open-ended question, right? Vanillaware doesn't seem interested in sequels. They absolutely could. They could probably make gangbusters off of a sequel to one of their more popular international titles. Unicorn Overlord has such a ceiling on it to produce more. But most likely, Vanillaware is going to do what they do. They're going to pick a different genre with at least some kind of RPG bent, and they are going to knock it out of the park in a like weird Vanillaware signature. We can't guess what they're going to tweak to make this unique way. So I'm curious, what genres would you all like to see them tackle next?
Yeah, so I would really love to see them make like a horror influenced RPG or adventure style game. So maybe not totally survival horror, but maybe more along the lines of something like the I don't know if you guys have ever played the Deathmark games. That's a experience. The dungeon RPG developer made those. But they're kind of like adventure games presented in like a first person dungeon crawler style, but they're horror games. Or just like some kind of horror influenced RPG. I would really like them to make, because I think that's something that they've maybe dabbled in a little bit. There's some character designs in Odin Sphere that kind of evoke that like horror aspect, but I think they could make some really scary and evocative visual design for a horror influence game.
I like that. I like that. And they could like kind of use some of the same settings in 13 Sentinels. Like if it's like a modern horror game, so
Mm.
it's like in the
Hmm.
city and stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
They can work
absolutely.
on how do you make a cityscape like that, but instead of making it beautiful, make it terrifying.
Yeah.
Honestly, my little Shadow Heart's loving heart was like bumping at that thought.
Yeah, yeah, and it's there's a little bit of a niche there with horror RPGs, so I think they could really like do something cool with that mechanically and narratively and with the visual design. Yeah.
Well, mine isn't the same, but like I want them to do so. I want them to make more modern environments. I want to see how they illustrate cities because I really like Planet 13 Sentinels. So I would really, and I've been itching for a good city builder, and so I would really like Vanillaware to like make like a Sim City like, or something like that. And I'm not sure how will work, but I know they can pull it off because they can also do like the top down style that they did with the strategy battles in 30 Sentinels. And yeah, I think it would look really nice. And yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Gio, because they've done now quite a few games that have that kind of simulation element to them. So it would be really interesting to see them like tackle a more like harder simulation style of gameplay and then like add those kind of narrative elements and stuff they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
I am definitely like that city builder thing is right along the lines I was thinking, except for mine was way different. It's because I think Vanillaware, and I think how good would they be at a Dark Cloud style city builder, where you have some kind of RPG element that who knows Vanillaware can go and run their shit and do something wild with the RPG side. But I'm gonna get chocobo. But then combine that with Vanillaware's take on that kind of simplified fantasy city building, kind of the concept of Giorama. I think that fits in really well with Vanillaware's kind of like fantastical, lighthearted aesthetic that they used a lot in their earlier games. Um, and I think their designs for the types of buildings that you could build, like, this is why I don't mind the modern city builder either, because I think that their designs would make that, a completely different thing than what we've seen from something like SimCity. But I think we could get similar results out of Dark Cloud, and that's where my heart lies. So yeah, I'll
Yes,
go with that.
yes. Yes, I'll definitely pony up $70 for that. Yes.
God, at this point, I don't think I could not pony up $70 for anything Vanillaware releases. Okay, Nick, we're putting the pressure on you now.
I'm thinking probably an anime girl gacha game.
Directly into Nick's wheelhouse. Yeah,
So,
let's turn them into Mistwalker and get
Like
into some
Genshin Impact or something. Yeah.
well, my favorite gacha closed this year, so there's a big hole in my heart. I was actually going to say city management, but then two of
We
you said
clearly
city
know which way Vanillaware should go next.
I just think of like Ni no Kuni 2, Nelky, and what was that? The Final Fantasy one. I always forget the
My
name.
Life as a
My
King.
Life as a King.
My Life as a King. That's it. Yeah. I always think of those games, and I'm like, man, wouldn't it be cool if this had really awesome art?
Yeah, there is
But
something to be said for that. Like, it's kind of a different flavor of city building for those,
yeah, like it's cool too because they mix a lot of narrative in with the city building, right? Like you unlock the inn, and you go and you place an inn, and then suddenly there's like a cutscene. So and that kind of reminds me of like the time gating with the 13 Sentinels. So I think it'd be really easy to do like a VN or adventure game and mix that with with just like city management.
I'm sorry, I ghosted for a second there because all I could think about is how badly I want to play My Life as a King right now.
Oh my gosh.
Vanillaware, if Square Enix ain't going to give us a port, you give us your version and I'm happy as a clam. So obviously there are a ton of ways Vanillaware can go. I'd be really interested in hearing listeners, sounding off in the Discord, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Threads, on Blue Sky, all of the places that we have social media presences, usually as RPG Fan or RPG Fan Com on most platforms. Before we get into outro stuff, let's hear about how you can get in contact with our lovely panel here today. So let's start with Ben.
You can email me at benloganlove@gmail.com.
And Gio.
Yeah, you can find me on Discord. I go by 10bstar on Discord, the RPG Fan Discord, I mean. And you can also email me at gio@rpgfan.com.
And now Nick.
You can find me on Blue Sky. Nickman writes at bsky.social.
Love me some Blue Sky. As for me, your humble guest host, sounds terrible saying that. You can find me at on Twitter at Wes Iliff, in the RPG Fan Discord as simply Wes, or find me as Lone Weasel on all kinds of things. If you'd like to reach out to Retro Encounter as a whole, you can reach us at retro@rpgfan.com. If you're interested in what's coming next from Retro Encounter, coming up, we are going to push Mike Sollosi through 2 episodes of Kingdom Hearts 2. I know a lot of you have been waiting for that one, and it is coming. We're working on a little something special for Halloween, and next month you can look forward to a couple of episodes on Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, which needs no introduction. I am so excited for those episodes. But that's not the only podcast that you can listen to at RPG Fan. We also have a Random Encounter every other week about news and recent topics, amongst other things, pretty random. And every other week, you can catch Rhythm Encounter about music, where we listen to all kinds of cool songs and talk a little bit about them deeper than maybe we should. Both fantastic listens. Please, if you listen to any of our podcasts, please review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, wherever. We love feedback. We love 5-star feedback, but do what you got to do. I would like to send out a special thank you to our guests, Ben, Gio, Nick, and special guest Mike Sollosi on the ones and twos. As always, everyone, have a good night. Be kind to yourselves out there.